Our special guest today is Abelardo Gil-Fournier and Jussi Parikka. And in this interview, we will discuss their fascinating new book, Living Surfaces, Images, Plants, and Environments of Media, which is out this year from MIT Press. So let me introduce both of my esteemed members. Abelardo Gil-Fournier is an artist and researcher born in Rabat and based in Madrid. Originally trained in physics, he holds a PhD in art from Winchester School of Art, UK, and has worked as a researcher at FAMU in Prague. He's currently a grantee of a Leonardo scholarship from the BBVA Foundation. His practice addresses the entwining of media and matter. His projects involve different techniques spanning from installations to image, sound, and computational processes where either the living or other so-called natural and planetary temporalities conflate with human visual cultures, knowledge systems, and politics. His work has been exhibited and discussed internationally, including venues such as Transmediale, Berlin, Fundación, Cerezales, Antonino, Cinia, León, IKKM, Weimar, Fotomuseum Winterthur, Switzerland, Design Museum Shenzhen, and the cultural centers of Spain in Nicaragua and El Salvador. He is the author, together with Jussi Parikka, of the book Living Surfaces, that is also a topic of our discussion today. And of course, Dr. Jussi Parikka is a professor in digital aesthetics and culture at Aarhus University in Denmark, where he leads the Digital Aesthetics Research Center, DARC. He's also a founding co-editor of the Environmental Media and Aesthetics program. In 2021, he was elected as member of Academia Europaea. Jussi's published books include Insect Media, 2010, Digital Contagions, 2007, 2016, A Genealogy of Media, 2015, and A Slow Contemporary Violence, 2016. Recently, he co-edited Photography Off the Scale, 2021, and is the co-author of the lab book, Situated Practices in Media Studies, 2022. Recently, the book Operational Images was published in May 2023, and the co-authored Living Surfaces, of course, with Abelardo Gil-Fournier in June 2024. Parikka's books have been translated into 11 languages, including Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Czech, Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. He has also worked as a curator, including as part of the curatorial team of Transmediale 2023 and Helsinki Biennial 2023, as well as the co-curator of the Motores del Climate Exhibition, Laboral Gijon 2023. It's such a pleasure to have both of you here on the screen finally. And yes, thank you for agreeing to be part of this interview immediately. So let me begin with the first question without much delay. So let me begin with the fundamental question, which is, what is your book, Living Surfaces, trying to inform its readers? Or let's say, to put it more precisely, what is the urgent need to read Planet via various mediatic forms?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We like doing these dialogues that include that and the ways in which we can sort of unfold quite a complex narrative of the book as well. Abelardo, what do you think? Shall I go first, or do you want to jump in? I'm happy to go first. We can sort of switch between our two. It's like a stereoscopic talking, a stereoscopic view, which is obviously what we did with the book, is that it is of us two together trying to figure out exactly what you asked about. So this also draws on both of our expertise and also our long-term collaboration with Abelardo. But we can slide in some notes about our collaboration perhaps later. Now, I will start a bit then. So I would say that one way of answering your question, a good question, is indeed with a response that it was always already mediatic. The notion of the planet itself is an interesting abstraction. It's an abstraction that we often think in terms of particular imagery taken from outer space across certain years of Cold War because of particular missions, such as NASA missions, and the ways in which particular key images, like in the early 1970s, captured the idea of the planet as a holistic entity and as we know, the usual part of the story goes that this was a triggering impulse for a lot of environmental consciousness as well. This idea of that we are all in this planet that is somehow floating in this dark space. But that was already, of course, a technological image. It is an image that was enabled by aerial, sort of a push towards space, in other words, rockets, photography, all kinds of sensing mechanisms. So the idea that all that it took to produce even that image was already fully technological. We are interested exactly in these kinds of technological mediations of the planetary, but not only in this remote sensing or, let's say, outer space images or globe images, but in patches of surfaces. And that already rescales the question of mediation of the planet in different ways, in ways that also builds a certain kind of a media historical narrative and a media theoretical narrative about visual culture of the planetary. We can sort of pepper that with some further notes of what it means, but it really is about thinking through that notion of the planetary itself set across a history of abstraction in a similar way that the environment as a term and as an idea is an abstraction. There is no such thing as that you can point to the finger and that's environment. It is a built up historically by way of all kinds of abstractions and some of which are media, but same thing applies to the planet as well. We can explain a bit what we mean by surface. Do you want to jump in, Abelardo, at this point with any
Yeah,
notes or
yeah,
on the surface point?
yeah. So yeah, going on your line. So I think the book tries to understand the fact that the planet, the surface of the planet, would have been different if all the mediations you have been mentioning had not taken place. So if the different technological so-called revolutions of the last 100, 150 years had did not include visual media among them, the most of the surfaces of the planet would have grown differently. This is a sort of statement we try to uh, discuss in the book in relation to the different entanglements between the growth of agricultural surfaces or the growth of individual plants as when observed or monitored from remote sensing devices or directly other forms of visual media such as analog or digital photography. So it is a book about how the surfaces of the planet are being connected, in a sense, to the monitoring systems, but also a book that takes into account that this link has been happening already from more than 100 years, and thus the vegetal mantles that configure not only the surface of the planet but its atmospheres have been affected. So it is a book about a transformation of the surfaces of the planet and thus its atmospheres as well, as a consequence of the actions of visual media. And we want to understand this fact by bringing it even as a statement that can be understood from everyday practices, including artistic ones, in relation to visual media. In which ways can we understand the visual if we take into account this space of transformations of these impacts in the, so to say, the metabolism of the earth as a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So it's again kind of related to this question also. It's interesting to register this shift here from let's say, mediatic forms as passive, impressionable objects. And let's say, the way we register a camera, it's there, it's lying there, we take it in our hands, we click a picture, and the product comes out. The thing itself doesn't have life, so to say. So I look at it, the shift from this passive object to media as material and performing agents. So what is this? What is the function of biological and ecological systems in manifesting this change?
Yeah. Do you want
So
to
I can
go,
jump in.
You do that.
So I think, so I can start by introducing the idea of scales. So we discuss in the book through several chapters how image systems have introduced different temporal scales as well as different spatial scales in the operations, in the operationality of images, while they were applied to biological, towards or in relation to biological systems such as plant, vegetal ecosystems. So we've analyzed how how the time of the image is introduced somehow into the time of growth of plants, how the scale of prairies, the continental scale of certain graminea, is introduced as well into visual systems through visual statistics, visual sampling, visual mapping techniques. And we've analyzed environments also of a deep sense of entwining between space and time, such as forest ecosystems, where light as a model of exchange is also modeled through visual media. So the living, the vegetal living, so plants, forests, prairies, have expanded somehow the operationality of visual media due to their characteristic plasticity. I don't know if you can
Yeah, no, I think you already
come
outlined
into
this really.
this.
Yeah, I think you outlined this really kind of a sort of a subtle philosophical trajectory that we are trying to map that resonates with plant studies and certain themes that are picked up there as well. But this really is, for us, primarily and first coming from the point of view of sort of expanded media studies, but also history of science and technology in those terms. And like you mentioned already, is that it is a move from thinking that media is about just transmitting something that is passive, that media itself is passive, that sort of agential form of mediation, that then starts to, a bit like that old, proverb that, for how does it go? I forgot it, but if you're holding a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. That the media technologies start to form the world in their own image, and the ways in which cinematic ways of able to tap into movement and cutting it and analyzing it as movement becomes fundamental for understanding certain kinds of plant movement, and then able to also pinpoint the capacity to operate on a particle level that, like Abelardo mentioned, is about scales. We're able to perceive also temporal scales that we didn't before. And that already implies a certain active role in terms of operationality. And we can talk about operational images a bit later. And then one thing that perhaps comes also later in our discussion, but I'll plug it already now there as well, that in the philosophical but also historical sense, this all implies a really interesting notion of media and visual media, and especially visual media that operates with light, but light that is not just light that illuminates something into an object of visual representation, but light that is registered at the surface of plants. In other words, of course, photosynthesis, or actually surface, but also cellular level of plants. So photosynthesis and similar kinds of chemical energetic reactions are somewhat implied in our reading as well as part of this parallel trajectory of visual media that then obviously becomes recognizable as in different modes, usually photography, cinema, remote sensing. But there's something about that energy, plants, light interaction that is seems to be almost cosmic. At least is in the sense of hinting at the start of life on the planet, but it is also a theme that really relates in fundamental ways to history of science across that period of roughly end of 1700s, early 19th century as well.
All right, fascinating. So
Yeah.
a paradox which I think emerged while I was
Yeah.
a reader of that book. So how is the book, or how are you two negotiating between images, let's say, that read the anthropogenic scars left by us, and inscriptions effectuated by human actions, of course, and the geoepistemic, that's on one hand. On the other hand, you have the geoepistemic and imaging practices that help in accelerating growth, or, for example, monitoring the health of crops. So there are like two very distinct, diverge purposes of media. But how are you negotiating those two in the book?
Right, exactly. Do you want to start, or shall I?
Yeah. So from my point of view, maybe so you can also.
Yeah.
So the cases we work on in the book describe a sort of dominant visual culture, so to say, that is imposed not only in terms of image but also in terms of territoriality and landscape. So the image modeled plant growth that you mentioned, the one that is practiced in relation to monitoring the health and growth of crops, we think it is related to the cases of ecocide, such as the defoliation of tropical trees, tropical forests, such as the ones studied by, for instance, Hanna Mesaros Martin, this Colombian architect and activist from forensic architecture, where vegetation covers are removed to facilitate the action of aerial surveillance systems. So we are dealing with a particular coupling between living surfaces, living entities, and image environments. And I don't think, maybe Jussi can add a more subtle point here, but I don't think we are establishing a distinction between these scars and these other anthropogenic surface activities, as they belong to a sort of cultural / agricultural dominant system, which we called the environmental surface.
Exactly. That's already implies a sort of a bigger point that we might not put it exactly like this in the book, but basically what it implies is exactly that this is more of a cultural historical point that is perhaps evident to everyone, but it's good to state it out that the things that we see as particular acceleration of growth might be the scar. And the ways in which the sort of, let's say, pharmacon nature of this is already implied. The pharmacon as the poison and the cure and the poison. That, for instance, modes of acceleration of growth that have enabled a particular kind of a regime of industrial food production is also the regime that has produced massive scale emissions as well as massive scale of biodiversity pollution and chemical pollution. So the ways in which we're kind of maneuvering this, like anthropologists puts, like Annette Sings and others put it, living on a damaged planet, we're sort of monitoring a damaged planet that always already is some kind of a scar. So it's that sort of like a double bind that we're also interested in.
Right. So again, I think there is one more parallel which I found in the book, which is which is due with the materiality of imaging and the synthetic knowledge that is generated, that emerges out of these living surfaces on the one hand, and again on the other hand you have to deal with the real living, the organicity of plant life, let's say, which embodies deep-rooted biological and ancient networks of plant life. So do you think there is also this disconnection between the synthetic knowledge that comes out and the reality or the ancient plant-rootedness that is there on the other?
Right. So basically, I think briefly, I'll hand it over to you, to Abelardo, as well. But I think briefly, it's I want to sort of respond to that question by way of sort of perhaps a speculative answer as well. That we're very much interested in the media technological, and we're very much interested in the period that we are mostly addressing, 200 years or so of technical media. But what it implies and what interests me in general as well is that not only of how do media apply and make sense of plant life, and might sometimes also ignore the sort of a like long-term excused upon roots of plant life that go way back into all kinds of exactly ancient sort of formulations of how the planet and life and atmosphere was born. But what if we could overturn this question as well, that what would be the model of mediation that emerges from plant life? In which ways do certain kinds of themes that are ecological, biological, plant related imply a model of mediation that might or might not resonate with the usual definitions of media as well? This would lead into all kinds of interesting questions about visibility and invisibility, ecological connections, all kinds of things about understanding the immense complexity of even simple seeming root life. I had a really wonderful chat with colleague here at Aarhus University who's a specialist in imaging sort of the rhizomes of root life as well. And he was explaining how scientists also have had this moment of over the past 10 years of just like basically that has revolutionized a lot of the sort of ways in which they understand even seemingly simple gathering of nutrition from soil. The idea that the soil itself is this extremely complex thing, and this is of course resonates with people who know it from soil studies, that already that is such of immense scales of complexity that itself puzzles and hence demands a particular way of approaching it as well. But this is just as a sort of a brief thought as well. Do you want to continue, Abelardo, in any way?
Yeah, you are right. So we have one line in the background in the book, which is in which ways can we understand that the new or alternate ways of perceiving our visual cultures, in a sense that we can understand them as part of a larger space of relationships with light, which also incorporate not only humans but also other aspects and beings part of the surfaces of the planet. So this is a sort of aesthetic question that is there, but it is true that in the book we have focused on the dominant relation. So the cases are somehow that we have studied have allowed us to glimpse a history on the one hand of this domination, where the surface of the image somehow has been imposed on surfaces of the world. So there's a sort of pattern among the different cases we've analyzed. So moments that foreground the plant as a place of knowledge of its surroundings, environments, and how this knowledge that is situated is transferred to a different space, which is the space of the image. So a very clear case is the one that Robert Pietrusco has analyzed deeply. No? So which the use of plants as indicators and how knowledge of plants, the knowledge of plants on terrains, of the terrains where they grow, can be used as indicators on images taken from these plants as in terms of aerial imagings from above. So how this knowledge is transferred to the surface of the images. So we have followed different cases where this is the logic, where this is the pattern. So there's a moment of plant science, so to say, and we observe how the tools, image-based tools, end up by transferring this knowledge that occurs on the surface of the plant, how it is transferred to the surface of the image and thus recirculated and commodified in other ways and with other intentions. But our somehow background line is how can we start to devise alternative ways of dealing with these double binds somehow. I think that's these are the two arguments that are in the book.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. But since we are bringing in the aspect of light as well, so since this book is investigating the visual aesthetics and let's say the geopolitics of vegetal life, do we also expect another kind of inquiry? And that's also something which intrigues me of how light and images play a role in human bodies, let's say in shaping human bodies, along the routes of light registers and microscopic measurements. Because I do remember, the way post-Renaissance mapping happened, the anatomy was allowed, and, you are looking at into the human body as a kind of map. You're also colonizing the human body. And also we have discussed, how photochemistry and photography is also formed, via digital life. So I'm also thinking, how the media can also play some kind of role in shaping the history of the human body.
There's an interesting question of scales here as well, even if we don't really deal with human body, but that's sort of a point that you raise about the sort of interiority and exteriority as part of a regime of visual scoping is of course part of the ways in which visuality itself becomes a mode of intervening, of even entering particular kinds of interiorities as well. This is metaphorical as well, of course, the ways in which light, makes things seen and hence understood in the sort of a European Enlightenment discourse, but also the ways in which it starts to build a sense of what is interior and what is exterior. Much of the things we deal are exterior spaces, in other words, landscapes, things that seem to be under the sun. But at the same time, that is already encased in multiple nestings. In other words, greenhouses, in other kinds of nestings that encase light as well. So the idea that we really toyed with the whole book throughout as well, and I hope, readers in general appreciate our slightly weird way of combining artistic and speculative thinking with historical cases that are very much, in that sense, based in concrete source work as well and academic work, that we wanted to play with this notion of multiple scales at which light becomes operative. The idea of the chlorophyll being encased in plant cells and the ways in which that becomes an interior around which all kinds of glass encasings start to form interiors for plants, but also entering light, and the ways in which these build different sizes of regimes of temperature, of light, and hence of knowing. So I could say that anatomy perhaps is a one version of the sort of encasing of knowledge and light, and the ways in which we can probe the human body from inside out as well. That becomes a spectacle of knowledge, as we know from iconography of Renaissance and post-Renaissance paintings, and the ways in which that's sense of knowing by way of looking into is part of it. But what we are looking into in this book and the concrete cases are interesting version of that. Human bodies are not transparent, but most of the things that are built for plants are transparent. And that question of glass, that question of light, and that question of entering into, or perhaps also reflecting upon glass becomes interesting. And this is where, again, I'm going to hand it over to Abelardo, whose brain is amazing and imaginative on these ones as well. And it's there sort of to work with artistic methods. The idea that we're playing with these different versions of light, reflection, and such is here crucial. Do you want to pick up on this note or something else, Abelardo?
Yeah, I would add on what you've said already, which is really interesting, as we have not dealt with bodies on specifically human bodies in the book. So this is somehow a conversation that we are elaborating. So thinking that we are elaborating right now, I would add the notion of the warmth of light, the heat element related. So, for instance, in the 18th century experiments, it was not clear why plants reoriented their growth towards light. It was not clear whether they saw light or they experienced the warmth. The second option was believed. And by drawing the analogy, by understanding that plants had a sort of skin, and I think an answer to your question, Professor Datta, would be that in which ways this type of researchers brings in skin in relation to this expanded notion of visual cultures, in which ways the warmth or the extreme hot that is increasingly characteristic of the experience of light needs to be addressed as part of this expanded visual culture. So Jussi and I have been very interested, for instance, in the labor processes, while they are not discussed in depth in the book, but the agricultural workers or workers in plant nurseries and their negotiation with the environmental conditions, why they bring in, why they are growing these images, which is being part of the materiality of this environment of living surfaces.
No,
so it is a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of jump in as well, because this is a totally sort of this is like the sort of a thread that keeps on going now. But I'm sort of thinking that there's something again philosophical, the ways in which this would lay out a particular agenda about the skin and Deleuzian ways of understanding the skin as this deepest surface that there is, and the idea that this implies, the idea that the skin that is not only contained, but the skin that sort of weaves into its outsides and becomes this full exteriority. There's something there as a philosophical trope that we find appealing as well. But back to you again.
Yeah, I agree. That's the point.
Yeah.
So that's
exactly.
This,
right,
expanded visuality. So
right. So there's this beautiful line right in the middle of the book, which I'm quoting: the world already gives views on how to read it as cinema before cinema, as images before technical images. This is not really a question per se, but could you speak on a little, maybe with reference to the aesthetic field setting in Tarkovsky's The Mirror, which is my favorite bit, and landmarking and programming and sensing in precision agriculture practices that you're also merging with cinema? Can you just talk about a little this fascinating part in the book?
Yes. Abelardo, you wanna? This is also territory for you.
So we think it is interesting to see moments like this one by Tarkovsky, whose cinematography has been referred as a sort of vegetal filmmaking, by some scholars such as Greg Wooling. So these type of moments as instances where it is possible to glimpse this other ecological approach to visual culture. So as moments where it can be taken into account that in a sense the vegetal world itself can be understood as a visual culture prior to that of the human, and that repurposing of agricultural fields such as Tarkovsky at the beginning of his film The Mirror, where buckwheat is planted again in order to fit the memory Tarkovsky had of the prairies in front of his villa, his dacha, no? So it can be somehow thought as a in terms of reciprocity, in which ways visual acts can be also corresponded with material acts acting intention with an intention in the surface of the earth. So I think the notion of reciprocity is interesting once we are engaged into circuits of into our visual cultures, and as it is interesting to understand ecosystems as visual entities on their own. So maybe Jussi, you want to continue into this line? I don't know.
Yeah, that's
It's a
great.
complex question.
No, exactly. I think that's great. I don't have much to add. It's just that sort of a really interesting thing about continuity of film with other forms of sensing and imaging that are not necessarily historically film, but they have been incorporated into the discursive material of how film becomes an investigation of its own existence and its own relation with other materials. Tarkovsky is amazing in this sense, with the ways in which then a cinematic image and montage comes to play a role with particular vegetal fields, but also other sort of elemental media atmospherics like wind, for instance, that is one of our interests as well. And the idea that perhaps there are indeed, not perhaps, there are existing modes of sensing that already fulfill a particular role that we would usually ascribe to cinema. The ideas of sensing and movement, sensing and memory, and such are interesting. And this sounds almost like mystical, but it's not necessarily doesn't need to be. That's not our point. It is more like trying to find more in the Deleuzian perhaps and some others version of like what are the crucial concepts that let us tap into and understand the forces of sensation and sensing in that kind of a trajectory that perhaps becomes crystallized with film in this case, but also in other cases of our book with other technologies like remote sensing. So that's pretty much a short version of a nice point that you just made. Thank you.
Right. We're almost towards the end since Professor Parikka is doesn't have much time. But I'm just going to ask this question, which also has been bothering me. So when this book talks about at length about the grounding of, let's say, surface truths and image territory synthetic relations, so how do you count also, let's say, for the colonial exploitation, drone wars, and genocide that employ AI synthetic geographies and people less simulated territories? Because I'm also thinking of, this kind of uprooting when we discuss glass cases, because it also gives us a very inverse idea that nature is rather dependent on humans, which is not really true. So how do you explore the other side of this image sensing, so to say?
True. There's multiple answers to that. I can start with a couple of thoughts, and Abelardo can continue. It's first of all to state the obvious. Much of history of cultivation of growth is also overlapped or intersected with histories of violence, of enslavement, of forms of appropriation, the ways in which colonial forms of incorporating settler colonies, for instance, of course, and multiple guises of that version was premised on the agricultural. And that was already, to me as a historian, I'm always fascinated about the obviously very bizarre but also very effective logic of colonial powers upon settling upon different parts of the world and using particular forms of property-based thinking and also agricultural thinking as their way of entering and justifying that appropriation of land. So, for instance, the idea that, okay, because indigenous populations are not properly, according to our standards, taking care of the land, and our standard is our version of agricultural. This is why we have the right, not just we have the right to take upon these lands. So the kind of a premise of colonial forms of templating, of terraforming was in large case agricultural and related to plants or understanding of plants. And of course, not just agriculture, but forestry and other forms of incorporating their own logic into it in violent ways, right? And that is one part of the story. The other one that we are sort of hinting at and sort of giving our hat tips towards is the important work, which has also piggybacked or sort of pointed to the use of warfare by way of herbicides, for instance. So we look at the various couple of case studies of forensic architecture and people affiliated forensic architecture who have looked at weaponization of different forms of cultivation or the opposite of destruction of crops. A very unfortunately constantly persistent example where this is happening is, of course, Gaza and Palestinian lands, and the ways in which IDF has, for a long time, sort of used particular systematic programs to destroy plants. So not only, if that wasn't enough already, but not only the destruction of human lives, but also destruction of means of habitability and living. In other words, growing. So that's one thing where we sort of see the intersection. So I didn't even address yet the AI and synthetic things, but that's already a couple of things that seem to be low tech, but extremely violently present in our thinking and awareness as well. What do you think, Abelardo? What are the other things that we sort of think through in this manner?
Yeah, so there's also a notion of aspiration of the technologies, of desire even involved in this relationship that we've been addressing, which is that this idea that all events on the surface of the planet can be taken as events on a screen. That everything can be monitored as if it were happening on the surface of a screen in contemporary terms. So it is, in other words, what the CEO of an environmental intelligence company named the living atlas of the world, this fantasy that you can have a real-time video of every spot on Earth. And it is a fantasy of control and domination that needs to be responded by adding layers of legislation and regulation that need to address this media aspect of dominance, of practices of surveillance and monitoring. And of course, I think that in order to, as a society, as a plurality of societies, that we need to engage in other types of practices where this relationship is addressed in these other alternative ways of approaching these wider ecologies of light that are either visual, that are either related to the growth of vegetables, and that are related also to the warmth felt by skins, the inhabitability of the planet. I think it is something we need to face. Of course, you mentioned it is not a moment of being optimistic. The strength of platforms, the overwhelming scale of current AI corporate developments, it is hard to face this concentration of power. But as societies with a plurality of approaches and approaches and media forms and mediums and ways to stay with the problem, so to say, I think we can not just stay without doing in a passive way. It is. So there's the illusion of the totalizing power is of course also an illusion that can be faced somehow. And an impression we've had, Jussi and I, while writing the book, in our workshops, etc., is while the world might look small in when it is understood as an element, a window, as a window in a screen. When addressed as surface, it becomes enormous, huge, and this sense of scale in relation to the physical needs to be addressed as a space of potential in relation to the totalizing fantasy of power that these image-based monitoring systems have.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. So, of course, my last question is: there is this paradoxical comprehension of forests, which extends towards afforestation and terraforming on the one hand, and of course the intrusion and deforestation on the other. So, do you believe that this is also one of the notes on which the book ends? So, do you believe that perceiving the world as images might offer a solution to human and non-human others in the epoch of the Anthropocene?
I wish we could come up with anything solutionist. Usually we're kind of trained to be against solutions in the humanities. We're sort of always anti-solution. I don't necessarily also believe in that. Some solutions would be great, but I don't know if I'm in the best position to say what is sort of a viable pathway towards actually a sustainable sort of a solution towards the sort of a multi-scalar escalation of all kinds of crap, excuse my language, that sort of starts to coalesce around these questions of that are really huge as such as well. I want to say that there is still hopefully a value in just being intelligently trying to map questions that are of significant value to understand the complexity of certain mechanisms through which issues of power work in relation to issues of large-scale climate change, and how that sort of impacts or is impacted by our sense of different kinds of surfaces. So the ways in which we understand, for instance, questions of forests would be one of those as well. What interests us, and it's partly in the book, but also partly not in the book, is the question of the forest itself as one sort of a template of terraforming, and for good and for not so good purposes as such. And the sort of a emphasis on forest is an interesting case of that ways in which concrete actually breathing sort of a carbon capturing forestry is mixed with the sense of abstraction that defines the planetary scale management or mismanagement of climate change. In other words, the ways in which, for instance, certain kind of certificate systems work upon plant surfaces like forests. I'm from Finland originally, and Finland is a particularly interesting and not particularly progressive case in terms of particular ways in which forests are being managed, for instance. I want to claim this might be controversial. It's a bit more complex than what I just said, but also that how carbon, markets, carbon emission markets, and the sort of ways in which that is being used as if a mitigation measure is at the back of some of the abstraction measurements of how a concrete forest becomes basically a unit of exchange for large-scale corporations, right? As part of their sort of mitigation measures. And by now, over the past couple of years, great journalism has, of course, pointed out that much of this has been unsuccessful. The carbon, mitigation market is not working. It is bogus, and we need something else. And that's the really tricky bit. And that's where I don't want to say that we find solutions, but I'm still hoping that our information, even if we're doing it in tradition of humanities and conceptual thinking and philosophy as well a bit, and artistic thinking as well, that sort of has some kind of role to play in not just raising generic awareness. I don't even like that word, but actually giving an indication of how to think about abstractions as part of management of the planetary. And then in this case, for instance, the concreteness of the case of what is a completely misused mode of abstraction in terms of the, forestry markets, carbon emissions or carbon mitigation measures. There's a bit of a rambling answer, but I hope it gives a flavor at least. Abelardo, over to you for final words in relation to this.
Yeah. Yeah, it is following your line. I think so. For instance, the phrase, instead of the phrase "the world as images," it might be interesting and in relation to forests, etc. So to understand the world as a plurality of entities with the ability to imagine. So I think an interesting, it goes in so this line goes in the aesthetic dimension of the book. What if we start to think that imagination is not only an ability of the human mind, but it is something that occurs elsewhere, and not only within animals, but also in other forms of vegetal life or even non-living systems. And what if we enter into this possibility space with the techniques we have at hand, that is, technologies that allow us to connect different systems one to each other, and to start acknowledging that our exercises and do not only belong to the histories of the human, but to wider temporalities, and to the expanded and larger temporalities of ecological ones, such as the lives of forests, etc., climates, etc., and even deeper times. I think this is a good exercise in order to reformulate what is human agency and what is human creativity and human imagination, in order to make it more terrestrial, so to say.
Exactly.
Right. So again, ending the session. So thank you so much for such provoking and intriguing observations. And I'm certain this book will be widely read and gather the attention it so highly deserves. And hope to have more sessions with you too in the future. Thank you so much for being a part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank
Really.
you so much. We really
Thank you.
appreciate this. Was really a wonderful dialogue with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes.
See you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.